The bells above the door chimed softly, announcing another customer. Amadi Alyawayzian glanced up from the stack of books on the counter, his hands dusted with the faint residue of old pages. A faint smile tugged at the corners of his lips, though his thoughts lingered elsewhere. The late afternoon sun cast golden streaks across the shop, illuminating the titles neatly arranged on mahogany shelves. Ebony Dreams had been his haven for years, a place where the hum of the world outside gave way to whispers of stories and secrets contained in ink. The customer was a child, no older than 10, clutching a crumpled dollar bill in one hand and a well-worn backpack in the other. "Good afternoon," Amadi greeted, his voice warm as a late summer breeze. "Do you have any books about pirates?" the boy asked, his freckled face lighting up with anticipation. Amadi chuckled. "I believe we do. Right over there, third shelf on the left. Let me show you." As he guided the boy to the section, Amadi's senses remained tuned to the shop's every sound. The creak of old floorboards, the occasional rustle of pages, and the muffled laughter of pedestrians outside. It was a quiet, familiar symphony. But then the bell chimed again and the atmosphere shifted. Amadi turned to see Officer Broderick Hale, stepping inside. The man's presence filled the small space, like an unwelcome storm cloud. Hale's sharp blue eyes scanned the room with an air of authority that felt less protective and more invasive. His hand rested casually on his belt, near the holster that carried his gun. Amadi's welcoming demeanor faltered for a fraction of a second, but he recovered quickly. "Good afternoon, Officer Hale. What can I do for you?" Broderick took a slow step forward, his boots striking the wooden floor with deliberate weight. He was a tall man, broad-shouldered, with a face carved from granite. His short blonde hair barely moved as he surveyed the shop, his expression unreadable but simmering with something Amadi couldn't quite place. "Just looking around," Broderick replied, his tone flat. Amadi nodded and returned to the counter, keeping his movements calm and measured. He had learned long ago not to give men, like Hale, any reason to escalate a situation. The officer wandered the aisles, his gaze lingering too long on the shelves as if searching for something incriminating. Amadi's fingers tightened briefly on the edge of the counter before he consciously relaxed them. He wouldn't let this man unsettle him, not here in his sanctuary. "Nice place you've got here," Broderick said after a while, his voice carrying a faint edge. "Thank you. I've worked hard to build it," Amadi replied evenly. Broderick's lips curved into something that wasn't quite a smile. "Bet it's tough, keeping a place like this running. What with all the competition in town." Amadi caught the insinuation, but he refused to take the bait. "The people of Fairhaven have been very supportive. I'm grateful for their patronage." The officer stepped closer to the counter, leaning on it as he fixed Amadi with a piercing stare. "Sure they are. Just remember, this town has a way of keeping things balanced." Amadi held his gaze, his voice steady. "I appreciate your concern, officer. If there's anything else I can help you with, please let me know." For a moment, neither man moved. The air between them seemed to thrum with unspoken tension. Finally, Broderick pushed off the counter and adjusted his belt. "No, that'll be all," he said, turning toward the door. But before he left, he paused, glancing over his shoulder. "You take care now." The bells jingled again as the door swung shut, leaving a faint draft in its wake. Amadi exhaled slowly, the tension in his chest easing slightly. He glanced over at the boy, who was now engrossed in a book about swashbuckling adventures. The sight brought a flicker of warmth back to his heart. But even as the moment passed, Amadi couldn't shake the feeling that Broderick's visit was a prelude to something darker. He had seen that look before, the kind that preceded a storm, and storms had a way of uprooting even the sturdiest foundations. As the sun dipped lower on the horizon, casting long shadows across the shop, Amadi resolved to stay vigilant. He would not be intimidated, not in the place he had built with his own two hands. But deep down, a quiet unease had taken root, and Amadi knew better than to ignore the signs. The evening brought a peculiar stillness to Fairhaven, as though the entire town held its breath. Amadi locked up the shop as usual, securing the sturdy wooden door with a bolt and checking the windows to ensure they were latched. The soft glow of streetlights spilled across the pavement outside, casting long shadows that seemed to creep closer with each passing moment. He lingered for a moment, gazing through the glass at the quiet street. The encounter with Officer Hale still lingered in his mind, a faint but persistent unease curling in his stomach. Not tonight, Amadi muttered to himself, shaking off the thought. He had no room for fear. As he turned away, his reflection caught his eye. A man in his late 30s, tall and broad-shouldered, with skin the color of rich mahogany. His neatly trimmed beard framed a face that carried the lines of resilience and wisdom earned through hardship. His dark eyes, sharp and observant, held a quiet determination. He reached for his coat, a simple navy blue garment patched in places but clean and well-kept. As he stepped outside, the cool air brushed against his skin, carrying with it the faint scent of rain. The walk home was uneventful, the streets of Fairhaven nearly empty at this hour. Amadi's house stood at the edge of the neighborhood, a modest structure with a small garden in front. He unlocked the door and stepped inside, greeted by the comforting scent of rosemary and thyme. His wife, Ifioma, looked up from the kitchen table, where she was stitching a torn piece of fabric. Her dark, coiled hair was wrapped in a scarf, and her warm brown eyes softened as they met his. "Long day?" she asked, setting the needle aside. "Not too bad," Amadi replied, his voice lighter now. Though we had an unexpected visitor at the shop, Ifioma raised an eyebrow. "Who?" "Officer Hale." Her expression tightened, and she straightened in her chair. What did he want? Just to look around, or so he said. Amadi pulled out a chair and sat across from her. But it felt like more than that, like he was measuring something. Ifioma's lips pressed into a thin line. "You've done nothing wrong, Amadi. That man has no reason to trouble you. I know. But trouble doesn't always need a reason." She reached across the table, placing a hand over his. Her touch was warm, grounding him. "We've been through worse. Whatever he's trying to do, we'll face it together." Amadi nodded, drawing strength from her words. The next morning dawned bright and clear, the sky a brilliant expanse of blue. Amadi opened Ebony Dreams as usual, greeting his first customers with the same warmth he always did. The shop was bustling by mid-morning, a mix of regulars and new faces drawn in by the promise of discovery among the shelves. By the time the sun was high, Amadi had almost forgotten the unease of the previous evening. But as the hours wore on, he began to notice things that didn't sit right. A police cruiser idled across the street for nearly an hour, its occupant barely visible behind the tinted windows. Later, a pair of officers strolled by, their conversation stopping abruptly as they glanced at the shop. Amadi tried to brush it off, focusing instead on his customers. But when the bell above the door rang again, his breath caught. Officer Hale stepped inside, this time accompanied by another man, a younger officer with sandy hair and a nervous energy that seemed to contrast sharply with Hale's deliberate confidence. "Good morning, gentlemen," Amadi greeted, his tone measured. "What brings you in today?" Hale didn't answer immediately, his gaze sweeping the room. Finally he spoke, his voice cool and authoritative. "Routine inspection. We've been getting reports of suspicious activity in the area." Amadi frowned. "Suspicious activity? In my shop?" "Not saying that," Hale replied with a faint smirk. "Just covering all our bases." The younger officer shifted uncomfortably, glancing between Hale and Amadi. "You're welcome to look around," Amadi said, keeping his voice calm. "But I can assure you, there's nothing suspicious here." Hale nodded, gesturing for his partner to follow him as they began to wander the aisles. Amadi stood behind the counter, watching them with a sense of growing frustration. The inspection was nothing more than an excuse. Hale's every movement spoke of someone trying to intimidate, to assert dominance. And though Amadi refused to rise to the bait, He couldn't ignore the simmering anger beneath his composure. When the officers finally left, the tension in the shop seemed to lift. But Amadi knew this wasn't the end. Hale wasn't finished, and Amadi needed to be ready. That night, as the streets grew quiet and the town settled into its usual rhythm, a different kind of sound broke through the stillness. It started as a faint crackle, barely audible above the hum of crickets. But within moments, the sound grew louder, more insistent. By the time the first flames appeared in the windows of Ebony Dreams, they were already too strong to be stopped. The fire spread quickly, consuming shelves and books in a relentless blaze. Smoke billowed into the night sky, carrying with it the scent of loss and destruction. Amadi woke to the sound of sirens, his heart racing as he threw on his coat and ran toward the shop. When he arrived, the sight stole the breath from his lungs. Firefighters were battling the inferno, their efforts valiant but futile against the roaring flames. "No!" he shouted, his voice breaking. He tried to push past the barricade, but strong hands held him back. "I'm sorry, sir," a firefighter said. "It's too dangerous. There's nothing we can do." Amadi's knees buckled, and he sank to the ground, his chest heaving with grief. Through the haze of smoke and despair, a figure stood at the edge of the crowd, watching. Officer Hale. His expression was unreadable, but the faint curl of his lips was enough to send a chill down Amadi's spine. The fire consumed more than just a building that night. It ignited something deep within Amadi, a resolve to... Amadi stood at the charred remains of Ebony Dreams, the morning sunlight glinting off the soot-streaked pavement. The acrid scent of smoke still hung in the air, a bitter reminder of what had been taken from him. But he wasn't broken. The fire had burned his livelihood to the ground, but it hadn't extinguished his spirit. Beside him, Ifioma placed a steadying hand on his arm. "We'll rebuild Amadi. Brick by brick. We'll bring it back." He nodded, the determination in her voice sparking a faint but steady ember of hope. "We will. But first, we'll find out who did this." Amadi had always been meticulous, and his attention to detail proved invaluable now. With the support of community members who rallied around him, he began piecing together what little evidence remained. Among the ashes, investigators found traces of an accelerant, a clear indication of arson. The fire was no accident. Then came the breakthrough. A nearby business owner had a security camera aimed at the street, and though the footage was grainy, it showed two figures lurking near the shop the night of the fire. One of them was unmistakably Officer Hale. Amadi felt a surge of vindication tempered by anger. The man who was supposed to uphold the law had weaponized it against him. But this was not a battle for rage. It was a battle for justice. Amadi's first stop was the Fairhaven Police Commissioner, Ewan Ashcroft, a man known for his strict adherence to the law. The commissioner's office was a stark contrast to the chaos Amadi had endured. Shelves lined with books on justice and ethics framed a mahogany desk, where Ashcroft sat reviewing reports. His silver hair and sharp blue eyes gave him an air of authority that was impossible to ignore. "Mr. Okachukwu," Ashcroft said as Amadi entered, gesturing for him to sit. "I heard about the fire. You have my condolences." Amadi wasted no time. "Thank you, Commissioner, but condolences won't restore my shop. I'm here because I have proof that one of your officers, Officer Hale, was involved in the arson." Ashcroft's eyes narrowed. "That's a serious accusation. I wouldn't make it without evidence." Amadi placed a USB drive on the desk. "This footage shows him near the shop that night. The investigation confirmed the use of accelerants. The dots connect." Ashcroft studied the USB for a moment before nodding. "I'll review this personally. If your claims hold, there will be consequences." The fallout was swift. Ashcroft's review of the evidence, combined with testimony from witnesses and additional surveillance footage, left no room for doubt. Officer Hale was arrested and charged with arson, abuse of power, and a slew of related offenses. The trial was a spectacle, drawing national attention. Amadi sat in the courtroom, Ifioma by his side, as Hale's crimes were laid bare. The defense tried to paint Hale's actions as a momentary lapse in judgment, but the evidence was overwhelming. Hale had targeted Amadi out of sheer prejudice, his hatred fueling the fire that destroyed Ebony Dreams. When the verdict was announced, guilty on all counts, Amadi felt a weight lift from his shoulders. Justice had been served. With Hale imprisoned and the truth exposed, Fairhaven rallied around Amadi in a way he hadn't expected. Donations poured in from neighbors and strangers alike. People united in their desire to rebuild what had been lost. 6 months later, Ebony Dreams reopened. The new shop was even more vibrant than before, its shelves brimming with books, crafts, and artifacts that told stories of resilience and hope. A plaque near the entrance bore the words, "From ashes we rise. From hate we find strength." At the grand reopening, Commissioner Ashcroft approached Amadi, extending a hand. "You've shown remarkable courage, Mr. Okachukwu. Fairhaven is better for having you here." "Thank you, Commissioner," Amadi replied, shaking his hand. "But the real credit goes to the people who stood by me." As the crowd milled around, exchanging stories and laughter, Amadi felt a deep sense of peace. The fire that had sought to destroy him had instead ignited a flame of unity and change, proving that even in the face of hatred, there was hope. And this time, Ebony Dreams stood not just as a shop, but as a symbol, a testament to resilience, justice, and the unyielding strength of a community that refused to be divided.